The archive record from the Galactic Council's final session is only 4 minutes and 53 seconds long. No one knows what happened to the last 7 seconds. Archivist Velsorin discovered this discrepancy 3 days after the council ceased to exist, when she was already the only surviving member of the Administrative Continuity Bureau with access to the original timestamp logs. She had been reviewing the record for what she later described as routine verification purposes, though her personal journal, recovered much later, under circumstances that remain disputed, suggests she already suspected something was wrong before she ever opened the file. What she wrote in that journal, what she suspected, what she had seen in the 48 hours before she began that review, none of that would become known to the broader galactic community for several years. When it did become known, it forced a complete reinterpretation of everything that had come before it. But that comes later. What matters first is this. The Galactic Council sent a single transmission to Earth. The transmission lasted 5 minutes by their own chronological measurement. It was not a negotiation. It was not a warning in any recognizable diplomatic sense. It was something closer to an announcement, the kind of communication a civilization sends when it has already decided and merely wishes the receiving party to understand the decision before implementation begins. The Council had sent transmissions like it before, 7 times in recorded history. Each of the 7 recipients had complied within 48 hours. Earth's response took 11 minutes, not 48 hours, 11 minutes. That was the first thing that confused them. Mara Osa had been awake for 31 hours when the Council's transmission arrived, and she had been awake for 31 hours specifically because she had known it was coming. Not the exact content. She hadn't known the exact content, but she had known something was being prepared. The intelligence had come through a source so indirect, so fragmented across 17 different intercepted communications in 3 non-human languages she only partially understood, that when she finally assembled it into coherent meaning, her first reaction had not been fear. It had been the particular exhausted clarity of someone who has been waiting for bad news long enough that its arrival feels almost like relief. She was 38 years old. She had spent the last 6 years as Earth's sole permanent liaison to the Galactic Diplomatic Relay Station, a posting that the broader diplomatic community considered important enough to maintain but unimportant enough to staff with someone expendable. She knew she was considered expendable. She had known for a long time. The Council had made no particular effort to conceal it. They simply operated on the assumption that she understood her place in the hierarchy, the same way a useful tool understands nothing but is useful nonetheless. She had her own understanding of her place. It was different from theirs. But she had never corrected them, because correcting them would have required explaining the difference, and explaining the difference would have required them to listen. And in 6 years she had learned with absolute certainty that the Council did not listen to anything that originated from Earth. The transmission came in on the standard diplomatic channel at 3:47 station time. She was already at her desk. She read it once, quickly. Then she read it again, slowly. Then she sat very still for approximately 90 seconds, looking at the wall. The Council's transmission said, in language stripped of all ambiguity by its own formal protocols, that Earth had been assessed as a Class IV destabilization risk. The assessment had been conducted over the previous 18 months. The methodology of the assessment was not included in the transmission, and Mara already knew from 6 years of experience that it would not be provided upon request either. The consequence of Class IV designation was immediate resource restriction, communication quarantine, and what the Council's formal language called voluntary sovereignty reduction, a phrase that had never in the history of its use involved anything voluntary. Earth had 72 hours to submit a compliance acknowledgement. Mara read the transmission a 3rd time. Then she began writing Earth's response. She did not contact Earth's central government first. She did not request guidance. She did not route the transmission through the 17 layers of review that were technically required by the protocols she'd been given when she took this posting. She had known, since approximately month 4 of her tenure, that those protocols were designed for situations the people who wrote them had imagined, not for the situations that actually arose. She had been quietly maintaining a separate set of protocols, her own, developed over 6 years of watching, listening, and waiting for the situations that actually arose. This was one of the situations. Her response went out 11 minutes after the council's transmission arrived. It was exactly 1 paragraph long. She never showed anyone what it said. The only copy that exists is in the council's own archive, logged as received, and the council's archive is now maintained by a single automated system that has not been accessed by any living intelligence in years. What happened in the 48 hours following her response is what the rest of the galaxy spent the next decade trying to understand. The first thing Velsorin had noticed, before she noticed the missing 7 seconds, was that the council's final session had been called without standard pre-notification. This was unusual, not unprecedented. Emergency sessions existed, but the lack of pre-notification combined with the session's subject matter and the identity of who had called it created a combination that, when Velsorin examined it carefully, did not make logical sense under any framework she applied. The session had been called by High Arbiter Cho Moon, who had been the council's most senior member for 11 years. Cho Moon was known throughout the administrative apparatus as someone who was pathologically cautious about procedure. The suggestion that he had called an emergency session without pre-notification was essentially the suggestion that a being constitutionally incapable of spontaneous decision-making had, for the first time in 11 years, acted spontaneously. Velsorin spent 6 hours looking for evidence that someone else had actually initiated the session under Cho Moon's credentials. She didn't find it. What she found instead was a secondary log entry, partially corrupted, recovered only through a reconstruction algorithm she'd had to write herself because the standard tools couldn't process the file format, that showed the session had been requested not once but 3 times before it was finally convened. The first 2 requests had been rejected. Not denied through normal administrative channels, rejected by the council's own internal system, which flagged the proposed subject matter as outside the council's jurisdictional authority. The council had tried to convene a session about Earth. Twice. Their own system had told them they couldn't. The 3rd attempt had been formatted differently. The subject matter had been reclassified. Velsorin stared at the reclassified description for a long time before she understood what she was looking at, and when she understood, she felt something she was not accustomed to feeling. She felt afraid. The council hadn't called a session about Earth. They had called a session about themselves. The detail that Velsorin could not explain, and that she eventually stopped trying to explain, was how Earth had known about the jurisdictional classification issue before the council's own system flagged it. Mara Osai's 11-minute response had arrived before the council's internal system ran its automated compliance check on the session request. The compliance check was a 63-minute process. It always had been. There was no mechanism by which anyone outside the council's internal administrative structure should have known what that check would find. And yet, the single paragraph Mara had sent, the paragraph no one alive had read, had apparently contained something that caused Cho Moon to delay the session request twice, while he attempted to locate a legal framework that would allow him to proceed. Velsorin knew this because the 3 session requests were time-stamped, and between the 1st and 3rd attempts, there were 44 hours during which someone had been conducting an intensive search through the council's own foundational legal documents. The search queries were logged. Velsorin read them. They were searching, over and over again, for the same thing, a precedent that would allow the council to take action against a member civilization without triggering the council's own self-limiting clauses. They never found it, because the self-limiting clauses had been written into the council's foundation specifically to prevent the council from threatening member civilizations. Earth had been a provisional member civilization for 11 years. Nobody at the council had apparently considered this relevant until Mara's response arrived. The provisional membership status, granted almost automatically when Earth achieved interstellar communication capability, essentially a bureaucratic formality, carried with it the full protection of membership while simultaneously being so low status that no one had thought to check whether the Council's proposed action against Earth violated foundational law. It did. The Class IV destabilization designation, as applied to a member civilization, was not legally possible under the Council's own charter. The voluntary sovereignty reduction consequence was not legally possible. The communication quarantine was not legally possible. Every element of the transmission the Council had sent to Earth was, according to the Council's own foundational documents, illegal. And Mara Osai had known that, had known it before she sent her response, had assembled the relevant legal references in 11 minutes, or had already assembled them, had been assembling them for some time, waiting, and had sent back something that forced the Council to confront what it had done. But that still didn't explain what happened next, because the Council discovering its own legal error should have resulted in a retraction, a formal apology, an administrative embarrassment. It should not have resulted in the Council ceasing to exist. Something else had happened during those 48 hours. Something that the 4-minute and 53-second record didn't fully show, and the missing 7 seconds might have, or might not have, and the reason those 7 seconds were missing was itself a question that grew more disturbing the longer Velsorin considered it. There was a man named Deo Osai, Mara's younger brother, who had served in Earth's Structural Defense Corps for 9 years before taking a medical discharge 18 months prior to the Council's transmission. The medical discharge was for a respiratory condition developed during an extended deployment in a low-atmosphere environment. It was the kind of injury that accumulated slowly and then became suddenly undeniable. Deo described it, in the single interview he gave years later, as the experience of your body informing you, long after the fact, of everything you asked it to do. He had not spoken to his sister in 4 years at the time of the Council's transmission. The estrangement was described by their family as mutual, originating from a disagreement that no one who knew them was willing to describe in specific terms. The general impression was that they had argued about something, and that neither of them had been wrong exactly, and that this was precisely why they hadn't spoken since. When the Council's transmission arrived, Deo was in a hospital facility in Accra undergoing his 3rd course of atmospheric therapy. He received a message from his sister at 4:01 station time, 12 minutes after the Council's transmission, 1 minute after her response went out, that said only, "They did it. I handled the legal piece. The rest depends on what they do next. I'm sorry I haven't called." He didn't respond immediately. He spent 20 minutes looking at that message. His attending physician noted an unusual spike in his monitored anxiety indicators during that period and went to check on him, and found him sitting up in his treatment bed staring at a message on a personal device, with an expression the physician described as someone realizing they had been right about something they had hoped to be wrong about. Deo's response to his sister when it came was also brief. It said, "How long have you known this was going to happen?" She never answered that message. Not directly. What she sent back 2 hours later, during the period when the Council was making its first failed attempt to convene its emergency session, was a file. The file contained approximately 1,400 pages of documentation. Deo, who had his own reasons to understand structural legal frameworks, spent the next 6 hours reading it. What was in that file is something that Velsorin eventually obtained fragments of, through methods she never fully disclosed. What she found in those fragments did not answer the central question. It deepened it. Mara hadn't assembled those legal arguments in 11 minutes. She had been assembling them for 3 years. 3 years. The timeline, when Velsorin finally mapped it, was almost unbearably precise. Mara Osa had arrived at the relay station 6 years ago. She had spent her first 3 years doing what she was expected to do. Attending diplomatic functions she was not invited to participate in, submitting reports that were not read, maintaining communication channels that were used to transmit Earth's requests and ignore Earth's requests with equal procedural efficiency. She had been, by every observable metric, exactly what the Council assumed she was, a representative of an emerging civilization that had not yet understood its own insignificance. Then something had changed. Velsorin identified the inflection point as a session that had taken place 3 years and 4 months before the Council's transmission, an internal administrative session, nothing Mara would have been expected to attend or even know about. The session had involved a routine review of provisional membership status protocols. It was the kind of session that generated its own archive record, and that record, unlike the final session record, was complete. Mara Os had submitted a formal observation request for that session. The request had been denied. Standard procedure. The denial was logged, filed, and Velsorin was now certain, never really examined by anyone. But the fact of the request itself told Velsorin something. Mara had known that session was happening. She had known what it was about. She had been denied access, but she had known, and she had submitted a formal request through the correct channels so that the denial would be logged, so that there would be a record of her asking. For 3 years after that session, Mara Os had submitted formal observation requests for every internal administrative session, even tangentially related to provisional membership protocols, resource designation frameworks, and what the Council's internal documents called civilizational maturity assessments. Every request denied, every denial logged. A paper trail through 3 years of bureaucratic rejection, building something that Velsorin did not immediately understand the purpose of until she had mapped the entire timeline. Then she understood. The denials were evidence. Each one documented that Mara had attempted to participate in processes that affected Earth and had been systematically excluded. Under the Council's own foundational documents, the same documents that made the Class IV designation illegal, systematic exclusion of a member civilization's representative from decisions affecting that civilization constituted a Category 2 procedural violation. After enough Category 2 violations, the decisions made during the excluded sessions became retroactively challengeable. After enough retroactively challenged decisions, the legitimacy of the authority that had made them became questionable. After enough questions about legitimacy accumulated, the Council's foundational self-review clause activated. Mara hadn't just known the Class IV designation was illegal. She had spent 3 years engineering the conditions under which the Council would have no legally defensible response to being told so. She had built, out of bureaucratic denials and logged requests and 1,400 pages of legal documentation, a structure that could only be triggered one way, if the Council overreached badly enough to use it against themselves. And then she had waited, and the Council, with magnificent and terrible predictability, had overreached. The self-review clause was the part that Velsorin hadn't expected. She had expected, once she understood Mara's strategy, that the outcome would be a legal challenge, a diplomatic crisis, a formal rebuke. She had not expected the self-review clause because she, like almost every other administrative professional in the Council's apparatus, had not known the self-review clause existed. It was in the foundational documents, but it was buried in subsection language that had been written in a legal dialect so archaic it required a specialized translation framework to parse. The Council's own legal staff had apparently not been aware of it. Mara had been aware of it. At some point, Velsorin suspected early in the 3-year preparation period, Mara had found it, understood it, and built her entire strategy around it. The self-review clause stated that in cases where the Council had committed multiple Category 2 violations against a member civilization, and had subsequently taken action against that civilization based on processes from which the civilization's representative had been excluded, the Council was required to suspend its own authority pending an external legitimacy review conducted by. And here was the part that made Velsorin's hands go still when she first read it. Conducted by a review panel assembled from member civilizations according to a selection protocol that the Council itself could not oversee or influence. The Council, in sending the Class IV designation to Earth, had automatically triggered the self-review clause. The self-review clause required the Council to suspend its own authority. A governing body without authority to govern is not, in any functional sense, a governing body. The Galactic Council had, in 5 minutes, legally obligated itself to cease to exist. The 48 hours between Mara's response and the Council's final session were not empty hours. Velsorin knew this because the archive records from that period, while incomplete, showed unusual activity patterns across 17 different administrative nodes. Someone, many someones, had been working. Not visibly, not loudly, but with the particular intensity that shows up in system logs as the kind of continuous methodical processing that happens when an organization is simultaneously trying to understand what has happened to it and trying to prevent anyone outside from knowing. The Council had known, within a few hours of receiving Mara's response, what they had triggered. Their own legal staff, once directed to read the foundational documents in the correct translation framework, confirmed it. Every element confirmed it. The self-review clause was real, it was binding, and it had been activated. They had spent the next 30 hours looking for a way out. This was the period when Cho Moon had made his first 2 failed attempts to call the emergency session. He had been trying, Velsorin believed, to find a way to use the session to formally recant the Class IV designation before the self-review clause fully activated, attempting to treat the situation as a mistake that could be corrected rather than a trigger that had already fired. But the Council's own system, running its automated compliance checks, had rejected the session twice because the proposed actions were themselves constrained by the now active self-review clause. They were trapped inside their own legal architecture. On the 3rd attempt, the session had been called with the reclassified subject matter, not a session about Earth, but a session about the Council's own legitimate authority, because that was the only subject the system would allow them to discuss. They had convened their final session not to threaten Earth, and not to retreat from threatening Earth, but to formally acknowledge under their own rules that they no longer had the authority to do either. 4 minutes and 53 seconds, 7 seconds missing. Deo came to the station 14 months after the Council's dissolution. He was not fully recovered. His respiratory function had improved but stabilized at a level that would require ongoing management, and the journey was, by his physician's estimation, inadvisable. He came anyway. Mara met him at the docking bay. Neither of them had announced the reunion to anyone, and the single image that survives from that moment, taken by a station maintenance drone running routine visual documentation, not by any person with any interest in recording the event, shows 2 people standing about 2 meters apart in a docking corridor, not embracing, not speaking as far as the image can show, just standing there looking at each other. His first question to her, according to what he later told the interviewer who eventually obtained enough of his trust to ask, "How did you know they would do it?" Her answer, according to what he chose to share, "I didn't know they would do it then. I knew they would do it eventually. Everything they'd done for 3 years was preparation for eventually." His second question, what if they hadn't? She apparently didn't answer immediately. She apparently looked at the wall, the same gesture the interviewer noted that Deo had described her making in the moments after she first read the Council's transmission. Then she said, "Then I would have waited longer." He asked, "How long would you have waited?" She said, "As long as it took." He said, "That's insane." She said, "I know." Neither of them spoke again for several minutes after that, and then they went to get something to eat, and the maintenance drone had moved on to document other things, and that was the end of the surviving record of that conversation. But Velsorin, who had spent months by that point trying to understand the architecture of what Mara had done, read that fragment of conversation and felt the first true chill of her investigation, not the cold of discovering legal technicalities. Something deeper. As long as it took. How long had Mara been prepared to wait? 3 years she had already waited. Could have been 5. Could have been 10. Could have been the rest of her career, the rest of her life, building that paper trail of denials and logged requests, maintaining those 1,400 pages, watching and waiting for the council to finally, inevitably, do what powerful institutions do when they stop believing anything can challenge them. The council had operated for hundreds of years on the assumption that the civilizations beneath them would always blink first, would always decide, eventually, that the cost of resistance was higher than the cost of compliance. They had been right, every time for hundreds of years, because every civilization they had ever pressured had eventually performed that same calculation and reached the same conclusion. Mara Os had performed a different calculation. She had not calculated the cost of resistance against the cost of compliance. She had calculated the cost of waiting against the cost of acting too soon, and she had decided, 3 years before the council ever sent their transmission, possibly longer, possibly from the day she arrived at the station, that she had more time than they expected her to have. The 7 missing seconds. Velsorin returned to them after she understood everything else. She had been treating them as an anomaly, an administrative corruption, a technical mystery separate from the larger one. She returned to them with different eyes. The timestamp showed the record as 4 minutes and 53 seconds. The session had been formally closed at a time that corresponded to a total duration of 5 minutes flat. The discrepancy between the formal closing time and the record length was exactly 7 seconds. 7 seconds of missing audio and visual data from the council's final session. Velsorin had assumed corruption, data loss, equipment failure during what would have been an extraordinarily stressful administrative event. These things happened, but she had also, by the time she returned to this question, spent months inside the council's administrative systems, and she had developed a very precise sense of how those systems failed. They failed in recognizable patterns. Data corruption from equipment stress had a characteristic signature. Transmission loss had a different signature. Deliberate deletion had a third signature. The missing 7 seconds had the third signature. Someone had deleted 7 seconds of the council's final session. Someone who had access to the archive. Someone who had done it carefully enough that it took a month-long investigation by someone specifically looking for it to notice the deletion at all. Someone who had, apparently, decided that whatever those 7 seconds contained should not be part of the surviving record. Velsorin sat with this for a long time. She was not afraid of the deletion itself. She was afraid of what it implied. Because the list of people with archive access at the time of the deletion was short, and the list of people on that list with a reason to delete something from the final session was shorter, and at the bottom of that analysis was a name that Velsorin had not expected to find in the archive access logs. Mara Os had been granted emergency archive access in the immediate aftermath of the council's dissolution, as part of the administrative continuity protocols. It was standard procedure for senior diplomatic liaisons during transitional periods. The deletion had occurred during that period. Velsorin stared at Mara's access log entry for a long time. Then she closed the file. She saved her investigation notes to an encrypted personal drive. She submitted her mandatory administrative report, which contained everything she had found except for one thing: the identity of the person who had deleted the 7 seconds. In the report, she listed that question as unresolved. It was the only deliberate omission in 300 pages of documentation. She had her reasons for it. She was not entirely sure she could articulate those reasons, except to say that she had spent months understanding what Mara Osai had done and why, and she had reached a conclusion that made her reluctant to create a record pointing directly at her. Not because she believed Mara had done something wrong. Because she was increasingly uncertain that wrong was a framework that applied to what Mara had done at all. The Council had threatened Earth, and then they had ceased to exist, not because Earth destroyed them, not because humanity had weapons or fleets or power they'd been concealing, but because one exhausted woman had spent years quietly and patiently constructing the conditions under which the Council would have no option but to destroy themselves. She had used their own rules, their own procedures, their own foundational documents. She had built a trap out of bureaucratic paper. She had baited it with patience. She had waited, And whatever those 7 seconds contained, whatever had been said in the final moments of the Council's final session, something that Mara had apparently decided the galaxy did not need to hear, Velsorin found herself thinking that perhaps Mara had been right. Perhaps there were things it was better not to know. But the thought that followed was the one that stayed with her, that she recorded in her personal journal, that she was still recording variations of years later when someone finally found that journal and understood what she had been trying to work through. It was not the legal strategy that frightened her. It was not the patience. It was not even the deletion. It was the realization that Mara had been prepared to wait as long as it took. That she had arrived at the station at 32 years old knowing at some level that the worst was coming and had begun preparing immediately. That she had absorbed 6 years of dismissal, irrelevance, and institutional contempt, had let them deny every request, had let them treat her as a useful tool, had let them believe she understood her place, and had felt none of it as defeat, had felt all of it as material, had taken every humiliation and converted it quietly into evidence. What kind of mind did that? What kind of person looked at 6 years of being dismissed and saw, not a reason to give up, but a reason to keep building? What kind of civilization produced people who could hold that much patience without breaking, without despair, without the psychological surrender that any rational assessment of the situation would have recommended? Velsorin had studied dozens of civilizations. She had studied their histories, their institutions, their conflicts. She knew how civilizations responded to power imbalances, with either accommodation or escalation, with either submission or war, with either acceptance of their position or direct challenge to it. Humanity had done none of these things. Humanity had sent a 32-year-old woman to sit in a relay station and log denied observation requests for 6 years while quietly reading foundational legal documents in archaic dialects, and had waited, patiently, irrationally, stubbornly waited, for the Council to make the mistake that would make all of it matter. And the Council had made the mistake, because the Council had believed that patience was a resource that depleted, that if you waited long enough, eventually the patient ones would run out. That civilizations, like individuals, had a tolerance threshold, and that threshold, properly managed, would always be reached. They had been dealing with species for whom that was true. Humanity, apparently, was something else. The review panel assembled according to the self-review clauses selection protocols came to its formal conclusions 14 months after the Council's dissolution. The conclusions were administrative, procedural, and in many places technical to the point of obscurity. They were also, in several places, remarkable. The panel's summary noted, without commentary, that the sequence of events leading to the dissolution had been architecturally enabled by a pattern of repeated procedural violations documented over a period of not less than 36 months. It noted that the violations had been documented in real time by the affected civilization's representative, through the affected civilization's representative's consistent and documented attempts to access relevant proceedings through proper channels. It noted that this documentation had been, at the time it occurred, interpreted by Council administrative staff as evidence of the representative's compliance with denial protocols. The panel had interviewed 12 administrative staff members. 11 of them had used some variation of the phrase, "She always accepted the denial gracefully," when describing Mara Osai's responses to the observation request rejections. Gracefully. She had been building a case for 3 years, and the people she was building it against had interpreted her patience as acceptance. The 12th staff member, when asked about Mara, had said something different. This person, whose identity was protected in the panel's records, had said, "I thought there was something wrong with her, not hostile, just. I kept feeling like she could see something I couldn't, like she was waiting for something I didn't know about. I mentioned it to my supervisor once. My supervisor said I was projecting human emotional complexity onto a being who was simply operating within her limitations." The panel's summary contained a final paragraph that Velsorin read and reread until she had it memorized. It said, in the formal language of the review process, The dissolution was not caused by malicious intent, superior force, or external interference. It was caused by the ordinary operation of the Council's own foundational principles as applied to documented facts. The circumstances that generated those documented facts were not created by the Council. They were created by one individual operating alone, over an extended period, using only the tools and access available to her within the Council's own systems. The panel finds no evidence of conspiracy, coercion, or extraordinary resources. The panel finds extensive evidence of sustained patience, procedural knowledge, and willingness to accept the long timeline required for the process to reach its natural conclusion. Willingness to accept the long timeline. Velsorin closed the report. Outside the window of her office, the office she occupied now in the provisional administrative structure that had replaced the Council, the office she had inherited partly because of her investigation, and partly because there was almost no one else left. The relay station's docking section was busy. New diplomatic missions, new provisional frameworks, new civilizations attempting to understand the sudden reconfiguration of galactic institutional power. And somewhere in the station, she hadn't seen Mara since the panel concluded its work, but she was still assigned to the station, still in her liaison role, still present in a technical sense, was a 38-year-old woman who had come to a distant posting at 32 with what Velsorin now understood had been, from the very first day, a very long plan. Velsorin thought about the 7 missing seconds. She thought about what might have been said in them. Some final statement by Cho Moon. Some acknowledgement of what had been done to them, how it had been done, and by whom. Some last words from a body formally dissolving its own authority. She would never know. Mara had decided she would never know, had made that decision efficiently and without asking anyone's permission, and had then walked away from the archive terminal and presumably gone to eat dinner and then sleep, because there was nothing left to do. The galaxy was trying to understand what had happened. The galaxy was trying to understand humanity, trying to categorize the thing that had occurred, fit it into existing frameworks, decide what it meant for the future. They were asking whether humans were dangerous, whether they were strategic, whether they had hidden capabilities, whether they should be feared. Velsorin thought these were the wrong questions. The right question, the one that kept her awake, the one she kept writing variations of in her journal, the one she suspected she would spend the rest of her career trying to articulate, was simpler and more disturbing than any of them. How long had Mara Osa been willing to wait? Not 3 years. Not 6. The documentation showed 3 years of active preparation, but preparation required a decision point, a moment when preparation began, and that decision point was itself preceded by something. A realization, an understanding. The moment when a 32-year-old woman arrived at a relay station where no one would listen to her and decided not to despair, not to give up, not to accept the situation or challenge it directly, but to study it, to learn it with the patience of someone who has already understood that the timeline is longer than anyone expects. What had she known, or believed, or simply felt, when she stepped off that ship for the first time? When she attended her first diplomatic function and was ignored? When she submitted her first denied observation request? Had she already been building then? Had she arrived with the plan already forming? Velsorin didn't know. She suspected the answer was yes. She suspected that the thing about Mara Osai, the thing about humanity, if Mara was representative of something rather than simply herself, and Velsorin was no longer confident she was only herself, was not the legal strategy, not the patience, not even the willingness to wait indefinitely. It was this, that Mara had walked into a situation designed to make her feel powerless, had felt it, had registered it fully, and had responded by quietly becoming the single most consequential person in the galactic diplomatic apparatus, without once behaving in a way that would cause anyone to recognize what she was doing. Not because she was hiding. Because she had understood from the beginning that the most dangerous kind of preparation is the kind that looks, to everyone watching, exactly like acceptance. The Galactic Council had threatened Earth for 5 minutes. They had believed in those 5 minutes that they were ending a problem. They had been looking at someone who had already ended them, 3 years earlier in the quiet accumulation of logged denials and archaic legal clauses, and they hadn't known, couldn't have known, had no framework for knowing, because they had never met anything that waited like humans waited, not patient in the way of stones, not patient in the way of the uncaring, patient in the way of something that has looked at the long timeline, recognized it clearly, accepted the cost of it, and continued anyway. The council had ceased to exist. Velsorin was still working. Somewhere in the station, Mara Osai had already started the next long plan.